In the late 1960s and early 1970s, as the Cold War entered a phase defined by technological saturation rather than novelty, space tracking stations quietly became critical nodes of strategic competition because while satellites captured public attention, the ground-based infrastructure that observed, cataloged, and interpreted activity in space increasingly determined how superpowers understood warning, intent, and escalation risk. These stations were not passive scientific observatories, but complex military installations designed to monitor orbital behavior, collect telemetry, and integrate space-derived information into national command systems. And their militarization reflected a recognition that control of space awareness, rather than control of space itself, would shape strategic stability. Both the United States and the Soviet Union expanded and hardened tracking networks composed of radar arrays, optical telescopes, signal interception facilities, and data processing centers, distributed globally to ensure continuous coverage, because orbital mechanics ensured that no single site could provide complete visibility, making geographic dispersion a requirement rather than a preference. The primary mission of these stations was to maintain a real-time picture of objects in orbit, distinguishing routine activity from anomalies that might signal testing, deployment, or preparation for escalation, and this task demanded precision, redundancy, and constant calibration, as misinterpretation could compress decision timelines with catastrophic consequences. Telemetry interception emerged as a central function, as tracking stations were designed to capture downlinked signals from foreign spacecraft, extracting technical data that revealed performance characteristics, mission profiles, and operational status, allowing analysts to infer capabilities without direct access to the platforms themselves. This collection blurred the boundary between observation and intelligence, as space tracking stations became integral components of broader intelligence architectures rather than isolated technical facilities. Strategic warning depended increasingly on the integration of tracking data with other sensors, as anomalies in orbital behavior, launch schedules, or signal patterns could indicate shifts in posture that demanded attention, and ground stations served as the first interpretive layer through which such signals passed before reaching national leadership. The militarization of these facilities was driven not by a single program or doctrine, but by accumulated experience, as early ambiguities and data gaps revealed how vulnerable strategic stability was to uncertainty in space awareness. Both superpowers concluded that without robust, continuously manned, and militarily protected tracking infrastructure, their ability to interpret adversary behavior in space would remain dangerously incomplete. The expansion of global tracking networks required cooperation with host states, covert access arrangements, and diplomatic cover, as stations were often located in remote or politically sensitive regions to maximize coverage, embedding space surveillance within broader geopolitical relationships. These arrangements added layers of complexity, as the presence of military-grade tracking equipment under civilian or scientific labels introduced risks of exposure and diplomatic friction. Yet the strategic value of uninterrupted coverage outweighed these concerns. Inside the stations themselves, militarization took institutional form, as personnel were drawn increasingly from defense establishments rather than purely scientific communities. Procedures were standardized for crisis conditions, and data flows were routed directly into command and warning systems rather than remaining within research channels. This shift altered organizational culture, prioritizing speed, reliability, and security over experimentation, and reinforcing the role of tracking stations as operational assets rather than research facilities. Technological upgrades during this period focused on sensitivity, discrimination, and survivability, as stations were hardened against interference. Redundancy was built into power and communications, and data processing was accelerated to reduce latency between observation and assessment. These investments reflected an assumption that space tracking would operate under contested conditions where deception, interference, or disruption were plausible risks during crisis. Analysts relied on long baseline observation to establish norms of behavior in orbit, allowing deviations to be flagged quickly, and tracking stations became repositories of institutional memory, accumulating data sets that enabled pattern recognition across years rather than days. This longitudinal perspective was essential because many strategic signals in space were subtle, emerging through incremental change rather than dramatic events. The integration of tracking stations into strategic warning frameworks underscored their importance, as anomalies detected on the ground could trigger reassessment of readiness levels, influence diplomatic signaling, or prompt precautionary measures, even in the absence of overt hostility. The militarization of space tracking infrastructure thus represented a quiet but consequential adaptation to the realities of late Cold War competition, embedding space awareness within the logic of deterrence, rather than treating it as a separate domain. By the mid-1970s, these stations had become indispensable to managing uncertainty in an environment where misinterpretation carried existential risk, shaping how both superpowers monitored each other's behavior and calibrated responses without crossing thresholds that could lead to escalation. This foundational phase established the patterns, priorities, and institutional structures that would define space tracking through the remainder of the Cold War, anchoring it as a critical component of strategic warning rooted firmly on the ground rather than in orbit. As the mid-1970s progressed, the militarization of space tracking stations accelerated as both superpowers confronted the reality that space activity had become deeply intertwined with nuclear command, arms control verification, and crisis stability, making ground-based tracking infrastructure a strategic asset whose reliability could influence escalation dynamics even in the absence of overt conflict. Tracking stations increasingly functioned as interpretive hubs rather than mere collectors of raw data, as information from radar, optical systems, and signal interception was fused locally before transmission to higher command, reducing latency and allowing anomalies to be contextualized rapidly by personnel trained to distinguish routine variation from behavior that might indicate testing, deployment, or deception. This local analytic capacity reflected a doctrinal shift, as militaries recognized that centralized processing alone could not handle the volume and time sensitivity of space-derived information during periods of heightened tension, and that ground stations had to possess the authority and expertise to flag concerns immediately. Telemetry interception during this period became more systematic, as tracking facilities refined methods for capturing, decoding, and cataloging downlinked signals from foreign spacecraft, enabling analysts to infer propulsion performance, guidance updates, and mission phase transitions that were not visible through orbital observation alone. This capability expanded the intelligence value of tracking stations, transforming them into platforms for technical espionage conducted under the guise of space situational awareness. The integration of telemetry data with radar and optical tracking allowed for cross-validation, reducing uncertainty and limiting the risk that deceptive practices or technical anomalies would be misread as strategic intent, an outcome considered essential for maintaining stability. Strategic warning doctrine increasingly incorporated space tracking outputs as baseline inputs, recognizing that deviations in orbital behavior launch timing, or signal characteristics could serve as early indicators of broader posture shifts, even when other intelligence channels remained ambiguous. This integration reinforced the need for continuous coverage, driving further expansion of geographically dispersed tracking networks to close gaps created by orbital mechanics and environmental constraints. Stations located at high latitudes, equatorial regions, and remote coastal areas gained importance not for their symbolic value, but for their contribution to uninterrupted observation, embedding space surveillance within global basing strategies that carried their own political and diplomatic implications. Host-state relationships became more sensitive as the military character of tracking facilities deepened, prompting efforts to maintain civilian or scientific cover while quietly upgrading equipment, security, and staffing, a balance that reflected the desire to preserve access without provoking diplomatic resistance. Internally, the command relationships governing tracking stations tightened as reporting chains were shortened and authority to escalate concerns was clarified, ensuring that potential warning signals were not delayed by bureaucratic hesitation. Training emphasized crisis conditions, with station personnel drilled in operating under communication disruption, power instability, and heightened alert, reinforcing the assumption that tracking infrastructure would be both a target and a tool during major confrontation. Technological investment during this phase focused on discrimination rather than range, as the growing density of objects in orbit increased the risk of misclassification, and stations were upgraded to improve resolution and tracking accuracy to avoid conflating benign activity with hostile preparation. Analysts relied increasingly on historical baselines constructed from years of observation, using deviations from established patterns as primary indicators rather than absolute measurements, a method that required meticulous data management and institutional continuity at the station level. The militarization of tracking stations thus manifested not only in hardware and security, but in analytical culture, as personnel were trained to think in terms of intent assessment and escalation management, rather than scientific discovery. This cultural shift aligned space tracking with broader strategic warning functions, placing ground stations alongside early warning radars and intelligence fusion centers as critical components of national security. By the late 1970s, these facilities had become integral to how both superpowers managed uncertainty in space, providing a stabilizing influence by reducing ambiguity, while simultaneously embedding space activity more deeply into military planning. The result was a paradox in which increased militarization of ground infrastructure contributed to strategic restraint by improving understanding, even as it underscored the dependence of stability on systems that were themselves vulnerable and politically sensitive. This phase demonstrated that the true strategic value of space tracking stations lay not in their visibility or technological sophistication alone, but in their role as trusted interpreters of a crowded and increasingly consequential domain, shaping perceptions and decisions long before any action occurred beyond the atmosphere. As the early to mid-1980s unfolded, the militarization of space tracking stations increasingly reflected the recognition that these installations were not merely supporting systems, but critical determinants of strategic tempo, because the speed at which orbital data could be collected, interpreted, and communicated directly influenced how quickly national leadership could form judgments under conditions of uncertainty. Tracking stations therefore became embedded within escalation management frameworks, as their outputs shaped assumptions about adversary intent, readiness, and risk tolerance long before any decision reached the political level. Analysts relied on these facilities to establish what constituted normal behavior in orbit, using years of accumulated observation to define baselines against which deviations could be assessed. a process that demanded continuity of personnel, data, integrity, and institutional discipline at the station level. Deviations rarely appeared as dramatic anomalies, but as subtle changes in timing, signal structure, or orbital adjustment that only sustained observation could reveal, reinforcing the importance of ground stations as repositories of long-term strategic memory rather than episodic sensors. Telemetry interception during this period grew more analytically demanding as spacecraft systems became more complex and signals more varied, requiring specialized expertise to distinguish routine updates from changes that might indicate new capabilities or altered mission profiles. This expertise increasingly resided at the station level, where personnel developed familiarity with specific platforms and patterns, enabling faster and more accurate interpretation than centralized processing alone could provide. The integration of space tracking data into command systems tightened further as reporting timelines were compressed and thresholds for escalation review clarified, ensuring that potential warning signals were evaluated quickly, but within structured analytic frameworks designed to avoid overreaction. This balance between speed and restraint reflected lessons learned from earlier periods, when ambiguity and delayed interpretation had heightened risk, and it underscored the role of tracking stations as stabilizing intermediaries, rather than simple triggers. Physical survivability remained a priority, as planners assumed that tracking infrastructure might itself be subject to disruption during crisis, prompting continued investment in hardening, redundancy, and rapid recovery capability to preserve situational awareness under stress. Host state arrangements continued to complicate these efforts, as political sensitivities constrained overt militarization, even as strategic reliance deepened, leading to layered approaches that combined civilian cover with military-grade capability. Personnel training emphasized operating under degraded conditions, including partial data loss, communication interruption, and ambiguous signals, reinforcing the expectation that station operators would have to exercise judgment rather than rely on automated classification. Technological evolution during this phase focused on improving discrimination and reliability, rather than expanding coverage alone, as the increasing congestion of orbit heightened the consequences of misclassification and false correlation. Analysts increasingly treated space tracking as a probabilistic rather than deterministic enterprise, weighing confidence levels and alternative explanations rather than seeking definitive answers, an approach that required institutional maturity and disciplined skepticism. By the mid-1980s, tracking stations had become deeply embedded in national security culture, influencing not only how adversary behavior was monitored, but how uncertainty itself was managed within strategic planning. Their militarization was thus expressed less through visible armament than through integration into decision-making processes that shaped posture, signaling, and restraint. This period demonstrated that the strategic value of space tracking infrastructure lay not in its capacity to detect dramatic events alone, but in its ability to sustain informed judgment over time, reducing the risk that misinterpretation of space activity would cascade into escalation. As competition intensified in other domains, the quiet labor of ground-based tracking stations continued to underpin stability by transforming complex, ambiguous orbital data into structured assessments that leaders could trust, reinforcing their role as essential, if largely unseen, components of late Cold War security architecture. As the mid-1980s moved toward the latter part of the decade, the militarization of space tracking stations increasingly reflected a shift from expansion to consolidation, as both superpowers recognized that the effectiveness of their space awareness depended less on adding new facilities than on ensuring the reliability, integration, and interpretive discipline of the infrastructure already in place. By this stage, tracking stations were embedded within layered warning architectures that combined radar, signals intelligence, and human reporting, making their primary contribution one of contextualization rather than raw detection. Station outputs were evaluated not in isolation, but as part of fused assessments that sought to balance competing indicators and avoid single-source conclusions, a process that underscored the importance of analytical rigor at the ground level. Telemetry interception continued to provide valuable insight into spacecraft performance and mission sequencing, but analysts increasingly treated such data as probabilistic evidence rather than definitive proof, reflecting accumulated experience with ambiguity, noise, and deliberate signal management. This cautious approach reduced the likelihood that technical anomalies would be misread as strategic intent, reinforcing the stabilizing function of tracking infrastructure within escalation management frameworks. Institutional procedures governing reporting and escalation were refined to clarify thresholds for concern, ensuring that potential warning signals were elevated appropriately without triggering unnecessary alarm, and these procedures were rehearsed repeatedly to maintain readiness under pressure. The physical security of tracking stations remained a concern, not because they were expected to be primary targets, but because their disruption could degrade situational awareness and amplify uncertainty during crisis, prompting continued investment in redundancy, rapid repair, and alternative communication paths. Host state sensitivities continued to shape operational choices, as access agreements and public narratives had to be managed carefully to preserve long-term presence, particularly in politically sensitive regions where overt militarization could provoke opposition. Personnel selection emphasized continuity and institutional memory, as experienced operators were valued for their ability to recognize subtle deviations from established patterns and to exercise judgment under uncertainty, qualities that could not be replicated easily through automation alone. Technological upgrades during this period focused on reliability, maintainability, and integration rather than dramatic leaps in capability, reflecting an understanding that stability depended on trust in the system as much as on technical performance. Analysts increasingly relied on historical baselines maintained by tracking stations to contextualize new data, reinforcing the role of these facilities as custodians of long-term strategic knowledge rather than transient sensors. By the late 1980s, space tracking stations had become normalized components of national security infrastructure, operating continuously and quietly without attracting public attention, yet exerting significant influence over how leaders interpreted adversary behavior in space. Their militarization was thus expressed through institutional embedding rather than visible force, as they functioned as steady providers of insight that shaped decision-making indirectly. This phase demonstrated that the strategic importance of space tracking infrastructure lay in its endurance, as sustained observation and disciplined interpretation proved more valuable than episodic detection of dramatic events. As Cold War tensions evolved and uncertainties multiplied, these ground-based systems continued to anchor strategic understanding by translating complex orbital activity into manageable assessments, reinforcing their role as silent stabilizers within an increasingly interconnected security environment. The consolidation of tracking capabilities during this period ensured that even as political narratives shifted and confrontation receded, the infrastructure required to manage uncertainty in space remained intact, prepared to support informed judgment under conditions where misinterpretation could still carry severe consequences. As the late 1980s approached, the militarization of space tracking stations increasingly reflected an awareness that these facilities had become essential to to managing strategic transition rather than merely competition, because the pace of change in international relations heightened the risk that misinterpretation of routine activity could generate unnecessary alarm during a period of political uncertainty. Tracking stations therefore functioned as stabilizing instruments, providing continuity of observation and interpretation, even as broader strategic assumptions shifted, and their outputs were used to distinguish genuine change from noise within an increasingly crowded orbital environment. Intelligence services relied on these stations to monitor how space activity responded to political developments, treating deviations in launch behavior, telemetry patterns, or operational tempo as indicators of adjustment, rather than automatic signals of threat. This interpretive role demanded restraint as well as vigilance, reinforcing training and procedures designed to prevent overreaction when data was ambiguous or incomplete. Telemetry interception continued to offer insight into spacecraft operation, but analysts increasingly emphasized confidence levels and alternative explanations, integrating space-derived information with diplomatic and military context before drawing conclusions. This disciplined approach reflected lessons learned over decades of observation, in which premature judgments had been identified as sources of instability rather than security. The integration of tracking stations into broader command systems remained intact, but reporting chains were calibrated to support measured assessment rather than rapid escalation, ensuring that leadership received context as well as data. Physical survivability and continuity remained priorities, as planners recognized that loss of space awareness during a volatile transition could amplify uncertainty and undermine confidence, prompting continued investment in redundancy and resilience, even as expansion slowed. Host-state relationships were managed with particular care during this period, as the political legitimacy of foreign-based installations became more sensitive amid shifting alliances and domestic pressures, reinforcing the preference for low visibility and cooperative framing. Personnel continuity and institutional memory were valued as critical assets, as experienced operators were better equipped to recognize subtle trends and avoid misclassification in a complex and evolving environment. By this stage, space tracking stations had become embedded not only in military planning, but in the broader practice of strategic reassurance, providing evidence that reduced incentives for worst-case assumptions during periods of rapid change. Their militarization thus served a paradoxical function, as enhanced military integration supported restraint by improving understanding and confidence, rather than by enabling confrontation. This phase underscored that the strategic value of ground-based space tracking lay in its ability to absorb uncertainty and translate it into structured assessment, preventing misinterpretation from cascading into crisis. As the Cold War neared its end, these stations continued to operate quietly, sustaining the informational foundation upon which political decisions rested, and demonstrating that infrastructure built for rivalry could also facilitate stability when rivalry receded. The experience highlighted that the militarization of space tracking stations was not solely a product of competition, but a response to the enduring need for reliable interpretation in a domain where ambiguity carried existential risk. As the final years of the Cold War unfolded, the militarization of space tracking stations revealed its full strategic significance, not through dramatic action, but through continuity, because these installations remained among the few elements of national security infrastructure that function largely unchanged, even as political assumptions, alliance relationships, and ideological frameworks shifted around them. Tracking stations continued to collect, interpret, and contextualize orbital data on a daily basis, providing an uninterrupted stream of information that allowed decision makers to distinguish routine adjustment from meaningful deviation during a period when misreading intent carried heightened risk. Intelligence services increasingly relied on these facilities to confirm that changes in rhetoric and policy were reflected in operational behavior, treating consistency in space activity as a stabilizing signal amid broader uncertainty. Telemetry interception and signal analysis remained central, but their role was now primarily confirmatory, used to validate assessments derived from diplomatic and military observation, rather than to drive independent conclusions, reinforcing the interpretive rather than alarmist function of ground-based tracking. Reporting procedures emphasized completeness and context, ensuring that leadership received integrated assessments that weighed space-derived indicators alongside political developments, a practice designed to prevent isolated technical signals from distorting strategic judgment. The physical infrastructure of tracking stations remained protected and redundant, reflecting a recognition that even as confrontation receded, the loss of space awareness could undermine confidence and increase susceptibility to worst-case thinking. Host state arrangements continued to require careful management, as the presence of militarized tracking facilities remained politically sensitive, yet their value in maintaining transparency and predictability provided a rationale for continued access under cooperative frameworks. Personnel continuity remained a priority, as experienced operators provided institutional memory that enabled accurate interpretation across periods of change, reducing the risk that unfamiliar patterns would be misread as hostile intent. By this stage, space tracking stations had become embedded within routines of reassurance, arms control verification, and strategic monitoring, serving as quiet guarantors of continuity rather than instruments of pressure. Their militarization, far from driving escalation, supported stability by anchoring interpretation in long-term observation rather than short-term reaction. This final phase demonstrated that the true legacy of late Cold War space tracking infrastructure lay in its capacity to manage ambiguity, providing leaders with the confidence to accept uncertainty without assuming hostility. As ideological rivalry gave way to transformation, the persistence of these ground-based systems ensured that changes in the strategic environment were observed, measured, and understood rather than feared. The experience underscored that in domains where visibility is indirect and interpretation complex, militarized infrastructure can serve restraint as effectively as it once served competition, translating technical observation into strategic calm during one of the most consequential transitions of the 20th century. In the final assessment of the militarization of space tracking stations during the late Cold War, the historical record shows that these ground-based facilities became essential not because they enabled control over space, but because they enabled control over interpretation. And in an era where misreading intent could compress decision time to minutes, that function carried decisive strategic weight. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, tracking stations operated as the quiet foundation of space awareness, translating raw orbital data, telemetry signals, and launch indicators into structured assessments that informed warning systems, arms control verification, and crisis management without drawing public attention. Their militarization was gradual and largely invisible, expressed through hardened infrastructure, disciplined procedures, and integration into command networks rather than overt weaponization, reflecting an understanding that stability depended on reliability and continuity rather than dominance. Telemetry interception and long baseline observation allowed analysts to distinguish routine activity from deviation, reducing uncertainty in a domain where ambiguity was unavoidable and where false interpretation could escalate rapidly. The The geographic dispersion of tracking networks embedded space surveillance within global political relationships, requiring careful management of host state sensitivities while preserving uninterrupted coverage and reinforcing the reality that space awareness remained inseparable from terrestrial geopolitics. Over time, these stations accumulated institutional memory that proved as valuable as their technical capability, enabling experienced personnel to contextualize anomalies and prevent isolated signals from triggering disproportionate response. As strategic competition evolved into strategic transition, the role of tracking stations shifted subtly from competitive advantage to reassurance, providing evidence that change in policy was reflected in behavior and allowing leaders to adjust expectations without resorting to worst-case assumptions. By the end of the Cold War, space tracking infrastructure stood as a rare example of military systems whose primary contribution was restraint rather than escalation, anchoring confidence in a domain defined by indirect visibility and technical complexity. Their endurance demonstrated that the most consequential military assets are not always those that project force, but those that reduce uncertainty, slow reaction, and preserve judgment under pressure. The late Cold War experience confirmed that ground-based space tracking stations were not peripheral technical installations, but central components of strategic stability, ensuring that as rivalry receded, the mechanisms for understanding did not collapse with it, and that the transition out of confrontation was guided by observation, verification, and disciplined interpretation, rather than fear of the unknown.